I want you to welcome to the program for the first time. We have New York Times bestselling author Amity Shlaes is with us. Amity, thank you so much for spending time with us this morning.
Good day. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Now, you are the author of some amazing books that really set the record straight and challenge maybe some traditional narratives that we hear about history. Obviously, your New York Times best-selling book, The Forgotten Man, Tackling the New Deal, and the misconceptions, what's taught versus what actually was. And you have a new book that's coming out November 19th of this year called The Great Society, A New History. What made you want to tackle this subject of the Great Society?
Well, as some of the listeners may have heard recently, a number of candidates are coming up with ideas such as guaranteed income or guaranteed health care, an extension of our health benefits, or immense job programs. There's a concern about technology today. There's a concern about tariffs today. And all these concerns were concerns of the 1960s. So in terms of the concern list, we're in a replay. And then the question is, what do you do? We know what they did in the 1960s. The Great Society was the program of Lyndon Johnson. That was his giant social program, which in turn, as a program, was a replay of what Roosevelt did in the New Deal. But in any case, what we learned watching the endeavors of the 60s is some were good, others were less good, and one of the enormous problems was we thought we could fix everything. And that's what you want to repeat to yourself. We thought we could fix everything, because that was the great danger, that we wanted to be great, not just good. And there we faltered. There we failed, because our ambition was too great and because government's ambition was too great. Over and over again, there are different ways to get to great. One is through the public sector. One is through the private sector. You can try both. We tried almost exclusively getting great through the public sector. That didn't work. And in the book, I show how some of the things the private sector did in the 60s were amazing and turned out to solve a lot of the problems that the politicians were insisting only the government could fix.
Wow. Tell us a little bit about how this Lyndon Johnson's Great Society gave rise to a silent majority.
Well, a great society tends to identify groups. I'm going to help this group today, that group tomorrow, and we all want to help the individuals in those groups, no questions. But what you do when you establish one group is you leave someone out who might need something, at least freedom, and doesn't happen to have his name attached to a group. It's sort of like airlines. When you go to fly, and they call out all the number one groups, and you like all the number one groups, women with small babies, veterans, and so on, right? But what happens if you're not in any of those groups, and you too need to board early for whatever reason? There's no chance on earth you're going to get to board early because you are not in a special class group. And that kind of gets you down. And other people might look at you and know that you need to board early. But since you're not in a group, they're going to be rude to you, right? And you're going to board seventh, and there's going to be no room for your carry-on. That's a good analogy for the society that we created. We took away the discretion of the flight crew and the people around in the queue, and we made a whole lot of rules that said these groups go first and everyone else forget about them, in effect. That's the silent majority. It's also the forgotten man, the term I use in the 1930s book. So it's always dangerous to make favored classes as much as you care about the individuals in those classes, because your ability to evaluate who really needs concern on a given flight boarding in a given airport in a given hour is very poor. Does that make sense to you, sir?
Absolutely, it does. And it seems like for whatever reason, you have people that claim to want to help or fix a problem. Now, sometimes I wonder how sincere, but there are people who are they sincerely want to help. And in order to do that, in order to help this group, you've got to take from this group over here. I mean, I know that was what the Forgotten Man talked about, because in your book, The Forgotten Man, again, that dealt with the New Deal. People were trying to fix these ills, to fix the Depression, and they talked about this forgotten man. But your book is focusing on a different forgotten man. Matter of fact, the real forgotten man. Go ahead.
We always create forgotten men when we remember specific men or women. So really, in the 1930s, we did that for the first time in a giant way. That's what the New Deal was. And of course, it entailed great spending. So state governments were undermined in the 1930s. That was the first peacetime period when the federal government, Washington, got bigger than the states. Wow, what's that about? Well, goodbye, Alexei de Tocqueville, right?
Yes.
Goodbye, the interesting discretion of states. So in the 60s, of course, we did that even more, and the courts did too. Right. All the laws we passed, they said the federal government knows better, and we had a few problems that were very serious, such as civil rights. Some people think, and I tend to agree with them, in some cases it was good to have federal intervention, the Civil Rights Act, but we went too far. We made too many federal rules. That we kind of pried open the last door, and suddenly the federal government was running everything. And what I have to put this for the poor reader and listener who might not know all these books and be a little bit dizzy with all these titles, I'll give you a concrete example. There's a hero in my book, and that hero is the governor of California, whose name was R.R. And R.R. Was really intent on tightening the budget of the state of California because the Constitution of the state of California said he had to. It's part of his job, right? Balance the budget, the way governors have to do, unlike the federal government. And the federal government kept sending in federally funded public interest lawyers who would go to court, and then the judge would say, oh, no, you have to fund these 200,000 people over here on Medicare, Medicaid, these renewed programs or welfare, and the state has to participate, and you have to do it. Otherwise, our state, the federal law says we have to do it, and these lawyers won in court, and Reagan's budget was no longer balanced. That was pretty infuriating because he's supposed to be in charge of the budget. That's what the state constitution says. He wants to be a good governor, and he thought very hard about the poor people. He just came up with a governor's solution instead of a federal civil servant solution to the problem, or a lawyer's solution to the problem. And that lawyer wanted to be a superstar civil rights lawyer or welfare rights lawyer or who knows what. And he was playing to a different crowd. And we have that very much today. You undermine local autonomy in order to make a national show. You're looking in a different mirror. You're not looking in the mirror of your community. You're looking in the national mirror because you want to be nationally famous, or you want to be popular in your national XYZ group. And the community, there's no regard for the community. And then the community feels empty to everyone. Yeah. And then people wonder why they're kind of Tocqueville sad, shall we say. Is that clear?
I like that. Tocqueville sad.
Tocqueville sad. Am I Tocqueville sad? Am I bowling alone this morning? I know the listeners have heard of books like Bowling Alone. That is, our community is gutted because it has no authority. And we're just a road to be traversed.
Well, I think
by a big truck.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. We're talking with Amity Shlaes. She's the author of this new book coming out in November, Great Society. She's a New York Times best-selling author. I kind of think that's. What popped in my head when you said that, a community being gutted. You also think of nations being gutted. I mean, you think of the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and with Brexit. I mean, sending money to Brussels and then having it sent back to them. I mean, that's very much. The way the states are treated now, we send our money to D.C., they send it back with strings attached, right?
They send it back with strings. So Reagan, what's interesting in this book, I don't know how it's going to play. It's not published yet. In fact, I'm editing a galley of it this minute, but it will go to the printer soon. And what I've learned reading it, what's interesting is I didn't expect the heroes who emerged in the books to be heroes, and I didn't expect the demons who turned out to be demons, because, of course, we're telling a story. We're telling a story about something our parents lived, which is the 60s, if we didn't ourselves, or our grandparents. So who spoke truth to power about this? It turned out to be Reagan. I didn't imagine, I just didn't know who would be a hero. And it also turned out to have some heroes in the private sector. I do not have Walmart. Shame on me. But I do have Intel, the computer chip company, the semiconductor business. And I actually have Toyota, because what could have made our auto industry more competitive? Toyota showed where we failed, and Toyota is an interesting company. And finally, I have General Electric, which is an interesting company too, and of course where Ronald Reagan worked when he was a younger man. And these companies said, wait a minute, in their ways, I think the private sector can do this. I think the private sector can provide a lot of jobs. The jobs might change because of technology, and we hear that concern again today, and people might need more schooling, but they should pick themselves what school they go to, and our job is to grow a lot so that we need the people so bad we're willing to pay to train them. So all that was going on. One party, sir, I never expected to be a big part of the book, and is the organized labor.
Really?
Yeah, and what is right to work and what isn't. And we all know that in some states there's a constraint to unionization, and in other states there's less of a constraint, so-called right to work states. And what the 60s is the beginning of the great migration of people and businesses to less unionized states. I think I must have read that in a book somewhere. I'd heard of right to work. I'd heard of the law that made right to work possible, which is Taft-Hartley from the 40s. But to watch the dynamic in action is amazing because, for example, General Electric wanted to stay in New England, but they could not afford the wages the union demanded.
Yeah.
New England is a nice place. There are a lot of states that are beautiful places. I'm from Illinois. But the union wages or packets, more importantly, were too big because the union wanted to make a great society. And the person, I don't know how old your listeners are, but the person I grew up hearing about was this UAW leader, Walter Reuther. Did you ever hear that name?
I have not heard that name.
That's an old name. Walter Reuther, he's head of the UAW, which was the mighty, mighty auto union, and every night on the TV it would be Vietnam, and Walter Reuther said, right? Walter Reuther said that the workers need an inflation clause, right? Some adjustment for the CPI. They need a COLA, right? Walter Reuther said, and Walter Reuther, the reason I found him wonderful and the UAW wonderful was he had all the good intentions in the world for his worker and for the American worker, and yet he might as well have murdered Detroit. He did, because he, in collusion with Henry Ford and the other automakers, made the wages so expensive and the package so expensive that the business went away eventually. And it was so tragic. And the thing about Reuther, Ronald Reagan lived on and became president of the United States, but Walter Reuther actually was in a plane crash very, very unexpectedly on the way to one of his union retreat buildings. He was building a union retreat complex. So he's actually a dramatic character in the history of the 60s. He meant well. He was wrong. Tragic hero. And he died. And so this is an era that's very close to us and very far away at the same time. The 60s. In most histories, they're about Woodstock where people smoke marijuana. That's not the 60s. The 60s is what happened to your job in the 60s.
Yeah. So talk about that because you mentioned that the unions, they wanted to make a great society as well. Now, was this somehow separate from the political figures at the time? Because I've talked to, you mentioned right to work as well. So I talked to, plant managers who, were in charge of closing down northern factories because they were opening in southern right to work states. And, it got to the point where you're right, that they couldn't afford it, but they also had a loss in productivity. So, you divvied up these jobs where, well, hang on, no, it's my job to shrink wrap this. You can't shrink wrap this. It's my job.
Oh, it's a union.
Go ahead.
In the U.S. union law? I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you.
No,
you're describing the way it was in a unionized state.
Yes, I am. Yeah, and how the companies just they can't afford what it became, and trying to carve out a piece of the pie for everybody by keeping my job and keeping this job separate. People just worked less efficiently, is how it's been described to me.
Well, it was like two nations side by side, and you know what? You're helping me. This is probably the first interview about this book.
Okay.
So I hope the audience forgives me. I'm thinking out loud. But there were really two Americas. There was the America for the worker and the poor person. That was the America of Karl Marx. Class warfare. And on the one hand, there's the angry worker wronged, exploited by the big capitalist company, right? And the other hand, there's big capitalist company. And they couldn't get along, so they had to have a lot of rules, hence the rules you described. And the union the worker, quote unquote, had to fight for his life, and the union had to fight for its life. So gosh darn it, they got rules that said if your shrink wrap job on the assembly line wasn't going well, you'd have to stop the whole assembly line or not. But anyway, you'd have to call the union electrician from 18 miles away, and he'd come in his truck, and production would be delayed for 1 hour while you waited for the right union person in order to honor union protocol, in order to follow the rules, in order not to have a strike. That was the American situation in the union towns, and it was counterproductive because the man on the shrink wrap machine might actually have known how to fix the problem and push a button, even though he wasn't an electrician, and he felt, even though his rights were being honored and he had relatively high pay, he felt like an automaton. He felt like nobody cared when he knew. So it was kind of dehumanizing for everyone. It was a theater. That was the union. And the rest of America lived in kind of Tocqueville America, where we all got along, and people in the store who had an idea for a new product might tell their boss, and they might develop it together, and guess what? They might both see an improvement in their standard of living.
Yeah.
That wasn't the Karl Marx of union land.
Yeah.
And it was kind of a theater, oh my God! And we've all. So I looked at Toyota, where actually, even though Japan is supposed to be a hierarchical country, that's what we learn. The worker could advise the boss about the shrink wrap machine, to use your analogy, and they would stop, and they would all kind of be glad together. And in that period, just for technically, Japanese productivity zoomed ahead, and we began not to make as many cars or widgets per hour or per worker because of this unionized rigidity. And I want to mention the companies participated too. So when a company was really unhappy, what did it do? Did it change the state law? Did it change federal law? Not usually. What it do is it went somewhere else.
Yeah. Exactly.
Such as Arkansas.
Yeah, exactly.
Such as, right. Could there be a Walmart? There should be a Walmart. I mean, I'm on dangerous ground here because I don't know enough about Walmart. But the big, exciting new companies, whether they're Intel or something else, usually did not spring up in Michigan, as lovely as Michigan is, because Michigan was so unionized.
Yeah, too many regulations. We're about out of time, but we're talking with Amity Shlaes, New York Times bestselling author. Her new book coming out is The Great Society, A New History. Not till November is what it's listed on Amazon, late November. But I do think there's a button here where you can pre-order with one click right there.
That would be well. We have pictures too.
Yeah,
we have pictures of all these people.
So I got last question here, and this goes back to in the summary of the book that I'm reading here. Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society gave rise to a silent majority of dispossessed citizens, made famous by Richard Nixon and celebrated by Donald Trump. How does what happened in the Great Society, how did it affect the election and possible re-election of Donald Trump? No, that's a loaded question.
Well, I don't speak much about Trump, and I personally work for Calvin Coolidge at the Coolidge Foundation, but whenever you create an interest group, you shut people out. That's the silent majority, and Nixon recognized that. Nixon pointed it out. President Trump did too. The proof is whether your policy lives up to your campaign rhetoric about great society or silent majority. So that's the question. And usually, what is the thing that you can give a person in any society? More important than welfare, more important than better Medicare, but more, it is a job. So a president, and here President Trump isn't the only one, who actually it lives in a period where there are jobs, that's not to be ignored. What we got after the Great Society, in the Great Society in the 60s, was we got very low joblessness, and then we got terrible unemployment as a kind of after party, morning after, more like it, in the 70s as a result of the economic policies of the 60s, including the Great Society. So you also want to think, what's the consequence later to what we're doing now? But in any case, in the 60s, they had enormous faith in government planning, and that was a big problem.
Yeah. Amity Shlaes, first of all, it's great to meet you. I appreciate the work that you've done. I look forward to reading this new book. And, I also very privileged that you would let this be the first interview on the book. And I'd love to have you on again, especially when we get closer, to talk more about it.
Well, we'll figure out which themes resonate and are useful for your listener. Thank you.
That sounds good. Thank you so much. Folks, we're going to make a separate video, put this up at conduitnews.com. Go to the YouTube channel, go ahead and subscribe and like to Conduit News so you'll get the notification. And we really appreciate you guys listening. It is